You're with Steve Austin on ABC Radio Brisbane.
I won't be with you on Monday. I'm sure you understand. It's ANZAC Day. And one of the features of ANZAC Day is hearing the voices and the stories of former Defence Force personnel. Retired Queensland soldier Heston Russell is one of those soldiers. He's actually making a run at the ballot box next month. You may recall Heston Russell founded the Voice of a Veteran movement, and he was one of those campaigning for a Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide. He's a retired Special Forces commander, and he's actually standing for the Senate in Queensland in the May federal election. He formed the Australian Values Party last year after 16 years with the Australian military. He'd served in places like East Timor, Iraq, and a number of deployments to Afghanistan. With ANZAC Day on Monday, I spoke to him today about the meaning of the day and asked him what is the ANZAC spirit.
ANZAC Day has historically for me been a nostalgic day where paused to reflect on the actions of those ANZACs on Gallipoli and how they fought so brilliantly that even our enemy, the people we were facing, still to this day commemorate that day. But for me, this ANZAC Day is actually much more about what Australia was like back then and hoping to cast ourselves back to that. There was less than 5 million people in Australia, and we sent over 400,000 young men between the ages of 18 and 44 off to war. Some of them, you couldn't Google Gallipoli. They didn't know, where they were going, but they knew why they were going. And the amazing part for me is, as we can imagine, all those families that had to step up and fill the gap of all those working age men back home, and the support and the purpose and that ANZAC spirit that was certainly on display overseas, but was forged and burned bright back here at home. And that's the message for me this ANZAC Day, when we've been so segregated during COVID. Our federation has pulled us apart. My hope is that we don't need combat or war to bring us together as a nation, that we can reflect on where others have been to do that instead.
What is the ANZAC spirit? You hear the phrase a lot. Is it possible to define it or articulate it?
Yeah, the ANZAC spirit for me is, it's always been, people talk about this ANZAC myth, but during my deployment in Afghanistan in 2012, when I lost Corporal Scott Smith in one of the most terrible ways you should ever witness, while we were trying to find the rest of Scott, for the next 3 hours, my guys were in contact with the enemy. After this bomb had gone off, everyone came in and attacked us. And everyone was carrying with them so much emotion. Scott, we knew him for 2 years. He was one of our best. And there was so much emotion that would make you want to break down and cry. But instead, they fought on. And they didn't fight on with anger. They fought on in order to honour his memory. And they fought on beyond what normal people should have to fight through. And that's just one small example I've lived through. But trying to put that in perspective of landing in the morning of Gallipoli and watching in the first minutes hundreds of your mates be killed with an overwhelming enemy force, and finding courage to push past all of that and act selflessly and seize the day, and again do so in a way that brought our nation so much honour from halfway over the world that it's still commemorated today. It is so hard to define, but even just talking through that and remembering where I've seen a spark of that brings the goosebumps and inspiration to me today.
Is it difficult to face fear and push through anywhere? My assumption is that the early ANZACs were scared. I'd be scared. Is it difficult to face fear, whether it at the Dardanelles in 1915 or at Afghanistan in our time?
It's a really great question, because during my one deployment Afghanistan in 2012, my platoon conducted 67 missions, killed 117 enemy, lost one of our best. And I can honestly say that it wasn't a single time that I truly feared for my own life during that. Whereas I'll get on a flight and hit turbulence and fear for my own life today. But it comes from, and we talk about resilience, it comes from this amazing proactive layers of resilience where you are there in the service of something greater than yourself. That is the mission, your nation, but also the people you're with. You don't want to let down the team that you're with. And that is where I just know I've been able to find courage, and seeing people find so much courage to not worry about themselves but be more concerned about others. And you're right, when we're alone and when there are those moments of fear, the key thing with the military on those operations is you're never alone. You're always with your team, and that courage is always provided from that team.
I want to grab that phrase, you're never alone. At the moment, Australia is having a Royal Commission into Defence Force personnel and their experiences with Department of Veterans Affairs and their time in the military. And the picture I'm getting is that when they come back home, ironically, out of conflict or out of service, when they leave, they suddenly feel very alone to the point of almost being traumatised. Can you speak to sort of some of what you've heard and followed in the Royal Commission that's looking at Defence Force personnel and their experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. The issue for our Defence personnel when they come home and when they choose to get out is that our Defence Force is required to just continuously generate capability, and when you can no longer add to that capability, you're moved on to an administration process and passed over to the Department of Veterans Affairs, which has no moral or emotional connection to you, and which instead you become a case file number and you go into a waiting line that sees at the moment 60,000 claims backed up with 18 months to 5 years. And I've experienced that myself. And you leave an environment that has the values of responsibility, accountability, leadership, teamwork, and enter into the large part of Australian society, which is more so focused on dog eat dog, selfishness, the lack of accountability, individuality.
Is that how our ADF members see Australian, civilian Australian life as every man for himself almost? The exact opposite of what you experienced serving.
Yeah, well, I transitioned out of my time in 2 Commando in Sydney, straight into Sydney, and I got thrown into an environment where you definitely live among it, but you're never fully connected to it. You go from a giant organisation, the Defence Force, that is where you work for purpose, not for profit, and the entire rest of the world is about profit, and that's the realities, but it sort of eats away at what you fight and stand for, and remove from your identity of being in the Defence Force and just being a plainclothes civilian in the normal life, and then being completely removed from that emotional connection that was defence. That's why so many veterans now experience what we call moral injury or moral trauma, where their belief systems that they've carried for so long, like myself, I came straight out of school, 16 years in the military. I believed that what I was fighting for in the world outside at least mirrored or even had an understanding of what I did, and Australian society doesn't, and we've seen that over the last couple of years. And when your beliefs are undermined, you go through this propensity to isolate yourself, and particularly for our defence personnel who are trained to always put others and service before themselves, putting their hands up and asking for help doesn't come naturally, and instead too many of them end up removing themselves from the equation.
I didn't realise until you informed me that the Royal Commission has actually announced that they are extending their timeline for at least another year. That's a real surprise. What does it indicate to you, Heston Russell?
Yeah, it's very disappointing, first and foremost, that it's gone through so quietly, because a lot of veterans and families already know 80% of the recommendations that should come out. We just need to get on with it. But it's a very important process in order to allow as many veterans and family to come forward to have their grief recognised and be a part of accountability. I definitely think, as we spoke before, that it demonstrates that there is a massive workload here. There is a massive amount of information coming forward, and it's only going to continue to come forward as veterans and families finally are getting more confidence to do so.
I don't know anyone who doesn't want to look after people who've served Australia, whether they've been in conflict or not. They know that, it's an unusual, environment being in the Australian military. I don't know any Australian civilian who doesn't want to look after or say thank you or care in some way. Is there anything that civilian people can do at a superficial level to mitigate the trauma that people who've served, men and women who've served, whether or not they've been in conflict, deal with when they leave the military?
The biggest information gap is education and understanding of what our defence personnel do. Over this last 2 years, our defence personnel have been pulled in every direction, supporting us here at home, COVID restrictions, down at the floods. They've unfortunately been subjugated to anger from the civilian population because they haven't been able to do their jobs properly. And what is happening is it's not the everyday Australians who are the issues, it's the politicians and the bureaucrats who get in the way of the federal support that's been mandated reaching our veterans. And what everyday Australians can do leading up to ANZAC Day is to do some research of what our veterans have been doing, do some research of some of the good stories, not all the bad stories that are being reported, to thank people for their service, but to listen and to make a veteran tell them about their story. Too often not, we just hold on to it because we don't feel like people will understand it, and we don't want to make people feel awkward for not understanding. And it's not about, wanting to be eternally thanked for our service. It's just want to feel like that we have a place in the world and life outside of defence, and that we were able to contribute to it some way in a positive way, and also to continue to do so. Just because you have been a veteran that's not your identity and legacy. Like in the Australian Values Party, we have 8 out of our 12 candidates who are veterans, but they've gone on to run businesses, run charities, have families. It's just a baseline skill set, and we need to, at a cultural level, realise that we then need to better support our veterans to apply that into their own businesses, industries, corporations, as opposed to simply wanting to feel sorry for them.
This is ABC Radio Brisbane. I'm interviewing Heston Russell, who's a former ADF member, but he's also a wannabe political candidate for the federal election in May. You have started and are standing for the Australian Values Party. Why? You've already served Australia in one capacity, in a military capacity. Why now in a civilian or democratic capacity, Heston Russell?
Well, the last 18 months of my journey were speaking out against the Brereton Report, removal of honours and awards from our dead soldiers, through to campaigning for the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide. During that time, I visited Canberra over a dozen times and got to see what is actually happening behind the curtains of the bum fight that is our current politics. Parties that are full of their own factions and more worried about advancing in their own profiles, in their own portfolios. And when I sat there and watched the collapse of Afghanistan last year and was rung by dozens of Vietnam veterans who were re-traumatised watching the fall of Kabul and remembering the fall of Saigon, that is when I turned to my friend Sam and I said, we need to be in there to prevent these things from happening, as opposed to being here trying to mop up and repair the rest. So we put the call out to the public, had 2,000 members join straight away, and during that last 6 months have gone on to get our 12 candidates. And as we've declared today, we'll be looking to encourage a hung parliament where we can get in there and influence the Defence Personnel and Veterans Affairs portfolio to continue this work over the next 3 to 6 years.
When you say get in there and prevent this, you mean get into Parliament and have an influence over, military policy or foreign affairs policy or defence policy?
Absolutely, because just prior to the collapse of Afghanistan, I was called regularly, emailed regularly by all the defence ministers and shadow ministers with defence portfolios. And then once I started getting in contact...
What did they ask? What did they want? Why were they calling you prior to the fall of Afghanistan?
Well, for instance, when Barnaby Joyce took over as the Deputy Prime Minister, he called me into his office and asked what I thought of Darren Chester, and I asked him to replace him, and he replaced him with Minister G. Through to Minister Dutton, before the collapse of Afghanistan, asked for my consultation on the proposal of a national day of commemoration for our Middle East area operation veterans. None of that happened because Afghan subsequently fell, and it would have been quite on the nose to have done so. But then when I called them up, after getting all these calls from Australian citizens to my charity, Veteran Support Force, who had their family members hiding under the beds in Kabul, being hunted by Taliban, and asking for who they can call and talk to. Instead, I got generic email responses saying they need to fill out this form for the Department of Veterans Affairs, scan it and email it. And I'm trying to tell these people and calling them to not have my calls answered. And that's again when I turned to my friend Sam and I said, we have to be in there to be able to go and knock on their door and have these conversations and not be blocked out, because this is what needs to be done.
So what are the values of the Australian Values Party that you've started or founded?
Well, did you know that Australia has an Australian value statement?
No.
No. So the Department of Home Affairs maintains the Australian value statement, and it's a statement that everyone entering into Australia on a visa or to become a citizen has to agree to. And my personal journey when I went through my own mental health decline and suicidal ideation was I kept comparing myself to the best version of myself in service. And I thought that it was those external conditions that I needed to reach that level of performance. But instead, what I actually did is I realised that it was those values that I held true to me that I needed to replicate in my life today and hold myself to. And in the military, again, we are a for-purpose organisation. The outcome is just as, if not less important than how you get to that outcome and how you set that legacy achieving those outcomes. So for me, when I look at all the issues we have in our current society, where we're focusing on budgets as our strategy, which are just management tools, through to a lack of accountability and poor behaviour within our political system, because there's no set of values that either Australians can expect to be treated by as a bill of rights or responsibilities, through to how they should expect our government to treat them and conduct themselves. So I found that statement, dug it out, and it all still rings true. And it's funny, the amount of migrant Australians I speak to who understand straight away why we're called the Australian Values Party, but so many Australians who are born here and take so much of what we have for granted, I have to take them on that journey.
So you're standing for the Senate here in Queensland?
I am. I'm standing for the Senate here in Queensland with another veteran, Jay Hansen, and we have 2 senators for New South Wales, Victoria and Western Australia. And we're running candidates in the lower house for the seats of Blair, McPherson, Wide Bay and Kooyong down in Victoria.
You've got a pretty impressive bus you're travelling around in. That would have cost a pretty penny to either lease and paint, because it's painted up on all your colours. So that's where are you getting your coin from?
I have literally sold everything I've owned and put it into this campaign. It really is an all or nothing campaign, and the bus has been great. I got to travel around Queensland the last few weeks just getting out and speaking with people, and that's where I came here this morning to make this announcement after speaking with soldiers from Townsville who haven't fired their weapon or done their basic training for 18 months, through to I met a soldier here in Brisbane who's self-isolated 10 times over the last 2 years, so being close contacts, manning borders, manning hotels, and hearing the rate of exodus of our Afghan and Iraq veterans, of our Special Forces veterans, at a time when the government is saying they want to pour billions into our defence industry and grow it to 80,000 to be our largest force since Vietnam. The hollow capability, the heart and soul, which is our people, the fundamental baseline of all capability, is being eroded from our Defence Force.
Heston Russell, leader of the Australian Values Party and Senate candidate for Queensland, speaking with me earlier on today.
Steve Austin on ABC Radio Brisbane.
Authorised by Heston Russell, Australian Values Party, Brisbane.